2. We have been, thank you for that. we spoke last week. We introduced a man named Boaz as our Ish Gabor Chayil. And I told you, remember that. And I'm going to be very repetitious with that. I don't care how you want to phrase this as an English phrase, as long as you stay within the realms of the word itself. But just remember, men of war that were honorable within the realms of warfare were called this. Leaders were called this. It not necessarily reflects his wealth, but from what we see within the narrative itself, Boaz is also wealthy. He is also a man of God. We see in verse, well, let's just read verses 1 through 7, and we'll point out that as we get there. What we're going to do is just review a little bit and pick up in verse, I think I left off in verse 4 last week. That's 4 to me. So, now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, and I want to point out that the word, if anything, I want to point out the word there, kinsman, is going to be a different word from what we'll see later as far as kinsman redeemer. Kinsman means he's a relative. Okay? It has nothing to do at this point with his ability to redeem, and we'll explain that later because I'm trying to build up to that and just give you the whole understanding on that. There's given of her husband a man of great wealth, and this was your Ish Gabor Chayil, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, again, which she's titled. I was thinking as I was preparing this week, this last couple of days, thinking the lesson over, I was thinking of Scarlet Letter. Remember how she was always associated with the Scarlet Letter that marked her? And I'm just saying, think Ruth is a marked woman, and it somehow stands out as a. Again, it could be dress, it could be looks, it could be both. It could be just familiarity with people in your neighborhood say, you're new to the neighborhood. But I think it's more than that because she's known as a Moabitess. Whoever recorded this narrative made an emphasis to keep pointing out she was a Moabitess. And again, and prayerfully you guys have read through the story, so you know the story. I'm going to say she's just Moabitess. So it's God's point of God. The Moabitess is more important than the Naomi of the story. But she said to Naomi, please let me go and glean among the ears of grain after one whose sight may find favor. She's looking for some grace upon her. And she said to her, go, my daughter. She departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come upon the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And she came to Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord with you. And this shows, again, marks that he was not only a leader, a mighty man of valor, an honest guy, he was also godly man. His name, Jews today see this word God, which is how to pronounce it, real right pronunciation. That name, which is a much. When you see the word in your text is Yahweh, it's like this, Adonai. So what they're doing is transferring this to this. Well, again, this, believe it or not, is truer to being Adonai than this is truer to being Yahweh. We're not even sure what that is, to be honest with you. Good to see is this even the Lord. Even it's not even a good translation. It's different again, just like Greek. There's different words for I am. So when I say I am going to the store, they don't use that. It's just anyway. We're going back to verse 4, and they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant answered and said, she is the young wife who returned from the land of Moab. She said, please let me gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. She has been sitting in a roll. Now, with that in mind, before I go into any of the understanding of the verses itself, other than this, the reapers were the men who are actually doing, oh man, I hope I'm not going to be too chauvinistic, doing the job. They were doing the reaping. They had the scythes out. And behind them were the gatherers, were the women, picking up the mess they made. I know. It's so hard to stay away from being chauvinistic. But no, there is, and I am going to say this, there are men's jobs and there are women's jobs. And in this society, an agro-society, there was a speed a man could get through with a fifth and amount of the ability of a woman. Now remember, we'll see later, I think it's in verse 17. Look at verse 17. These real women got, because she spent the evening talking about Ruth, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephod. She had taken the stalks that had cut, beat it on the threshing floor, tossed it up, got the chaff separated, and when she gathered the seed, it was an ephod. And she picked that up and took it home. I said, oh, little grocery bag. Ephod was 35 to 50 pounds. Okay, 35 to 50 pounds. Depending on what ephod, it's one of those old jokes, what's an ephod? It could be even 30 pounds. Okay, I buy those 40-pound bags of salt because I used to get the 80 pounds. And I used to buy the 40-pound bags of salt and ask my kids to get it out of the van. Right. And here's Ruth, maybe 26 years old, schlepping 4 pounds maybe, after she's worked all day in the field. Remember, she's gleaned all day. And then she did out evening, and then she picked it up and she gathered it and she took it back to Naomi and said, look what I got. It's weight distribution. Now, before we really get into the text tonight, what I would like to do is some background on servants and slaves in Palestine. Because again, in chapter 2, verse 5, it says, Boaz said to his, and the servant, verse 6 starts, and the servant in charge said this, and says, so there's somebody that's a servant. And I think our understanding of slavery and servanthood is very different. Sometimes were employed for wage, indentured servants. But most of the servants in Israel, as well as from the eastern peoples of the Old Testament times, were slaves, men and women who were held as property for various reasons and for various lengths of time. Now, it's kind of hard because there are still societies today that look at different peoples as property. But there was a lot of laws, and if you read through your Old Testament, there's a lot of laws on how to deal with slaves. And it's not what we think of slavery, even though there was that kind of slavery also. Some were taken captive in war. Those were foreign slaves. Some were children of slaves who were born in the house of the master, what we would call nationalized slaves. A slave might himself be a Hebrew. Through poverty, sold himself into servitude until he got back on his feet and freed for the year of Jubilee. So slavery among the Hebrews was usually mild and merciful system. The Bible, while it recognizes that slavery exists, does not always approve of it or disapprove of the practice. In other words, try and be neutral with the idea of slavery. You can remember, even though we're in the book of Ruth, we just got through with the book of Exodus, the Hebrew people had been in slavery for 40 years. So it was and had learned different things through that time of slavery as far as agriculture was concerned. Anyway, so in the middle, you still can do something. Numerous states were set up in law, and I'm talking about the Old Testament, for the regulation of slave servitude, which laws were regulated both the conditions and the duration of bondage. So you were not always... Slavery usually had a time sentence to it, just like we think of being incarcerated. You think today our penal system says you do X amount of crime, you go to jail for X amount of time. Unless you're... Never mind. But in this society, crimes you were put in slavery off your time kind of thing. There was a time, if, for instance, manslaughter, you had to go to a tree down and you were stupid and axe head and it flew off somebody. Now, I didn't mean that, and you probably felt pretty bad, but that was, you were sent into a ref, and they didn't want nutcases. In other words, you really killed somebody. Sentences. How many years have you been? 30 to life. 17 seconds. No, if there's manslaughter involved, you're sent to you. And we'll look later, one of the jobs of a kinsman redeemer is they could buy you back out of that. They could buy you back out of slavery. They could buy you back out of the city of refuge. So that's why I want you to keep in mind the slaves and the kinsman redeemer. There's a tie in there. I'm going to have to separate them in a minute, right? One source, slavery was absolutely forbidden. It was punishable by death to steal or kidnap any human being for the purpose of making him a slave or to sell him to someone else to be a slave. And that's in Deuteronomy 24:7. It says, if a man be found stealing brethren of the children of Israel and makes it of them himself, they shall die, and they shall put evil away from among you. It's great if you ever really look at the judicial system that Israel had set up among them. If we went by just parts of it, we'd have half the problems we're dealing with today. It was very definitive. Yeah, possibly. Exodus 21:16 says, and he that steals a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hand, surely be put to death. Does the Bible believe for the government to do? Somebody once asked me, do I think our country is godly? And I said, no. God's mandate was put to death. I'm not trying to be. Hallelujah. I'm not trying to be nasty or whole. The system was set up to and people will say, well, we'll still have murder. Oh yeah, that kill again. That guy will never again. And the best thing is, in the Bible, Deuteronomy, Genesis, Romans tells us the government's job is to carry out what God has mandated. God has mandated, if you do such and such. Listen to this. Kidnapping another person, holding them in that situation, anything is considered the death penalty. How many people have you seen in TV that kidnap somebody? What? Trial goes on forever and ever, and they get basically a big slap on the wrist and maybe, 3 squares, TV, rec room. Kind of. So. And the treatment of slaves, Leviticus 25:39 says this, for the treatment of slaves. First of all, each Israelite was given of God. When Paul says, how many times does Paul say, Paul, a servant of God? He's just going back to what Israelites had considered themselves to God. They were servants of God. And so we don't, whatever, but we're still servants of God. Did you ever think of that? And when we go through this, you're going to say, does this fit into the scriptural ramifications of me serving God? Kind of interesting, because it says this, that therefore he was not treated as a bondservant, but as a hired worker. And his master was to rule over his kindness. Even though it was a master-slave relationship, there was a I think he was beaten. Leviticus 25 says, that dwelt by thee, be waxen poor, and be sold to thee, not compel him to serve a servant, and I'll explain the bondservant in a minute, but as a hired servant, as a sojourner, that he with thee, and shall stay till the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from thee, but he and his children with him, and shall return. Until the day of his fathers he shall return. Now the difference, a bondservant was a servant that had X amount of money. And said, something, I love my master. My master's been very kind to me. I want to now be his servant for life. And they would take him up against wooden, and they would drive a nail in his earlobe and make a hole, not an earring hole, a hole in his ear, which means he's been bonded to his master forever. So there's a willingness to be a servant for life. So there's a difference between where a servant could be freed by, and we'll see, by a kinsman redeemer, or by the year of servitude under. A great example is my favorite knucklehead, who said, I really like your daughter, Laban. Know who I'm talking about? I'm willing to serve you for her. And he became a what? A servant of Laban for how many years? Isn't that interesting? And in the 7th year, he was free from that slavery. Ended up finding out that when he lifted up the veil, he went, ah! And he said, I have to work now 7 more years for. They're very good. You see, but they were both periods of. They're both periods of servanthood. They're both periods of servanthood, even though they're consecutive. He never became his bond servant. So at the 7 years, he's free. Even though it wasn't free to leave, because if you read the story, Laban still followed him and still wanted him to be part of his family and so on and so forth. But the idea behind it, he was... Right, but under the terms of 7 years would free him. So, several ways that a Hebrew could become a servant to his brother. Actually, I have ways. Several ways, but there's 4 ways. That he could become a servant to his brethren. First of all, the Israelite, through poverty, might become unable to manage his own affairs or maintain himself as an independent. In this case, he might pass by sale under power of another. In other words, it's different than me taking Kevin and selling Kevin. I'm actually directly selling myself. In this case, maybe this is Kevin, and saying, I can't afford my land, but at that time, I may have some land. Kevin takes me and my land. And at the end of that term that I've served under him, and I'm free at that point, I get my freedom and my land back. Kind of an interesting prospect when you think about it. It is understood to mean that an individual sold himself to another Jew so that he might be able to earn substance for himself and his family. And the key to this is, he's poor, he can't eat, can't sustain himself, he go do what for somebody else? As what? I ain't good at slave labor. $5 an hour, that's slave labor. You know? I want a job that has CEO as its first 3 letters, kind of thing. My dad used to tell kids, he worked with a lot of low-income kids, helping them find jobs. I think he stopped. Anyway, maybe need a parking lot monitor. The idea behind it is some people don't want to find a job. Secondly, a Hebrew who had been convicted of theft was required to make restitution to extent at least double the value of the amount stolen. If the stolen property itself was recovered, in other cases he was to pay 4 times or 5 times as much as he stole. So when Zacchaeus, remember wee little Zacchaeus up in the tree, when he was willing to repay what he had stolen, he was just doing what was biblical, what was not really biblical, but what was societally correct by repaying his debt. He didn't want to go into servitude, so he's willing to repay 4 times the debt. That's also found in Exodus 22, 1 through 3. Third reason, children of Hebrew servant became by condition of their birth the servants of the master. So if you're living for X amount of years, for instance, when Jacob served the 14 years under Laban, he had children during that time period. Those children were indentured to Laban and worked the fields. Well, they weren't old enough. They worked the fields. No, there's no child labor's law. They could pick, they could work, they could shepherd, they could do whatever they could do within, they had chores. They're done when he's done. Yes. They come under the ramifications of the time period the father served. Of course, 14 years, he didn't have all his children at that time. So I think it took him 35 years, Jacob? I'm not sure. I think there's 35 years between Reuben and Benjamin. I'm not sure. But he didn't have them all in servitude, so. Fourthly, when a man was claimed personally by a creditor, his children were usually sold into bondage with him, while the impoverished man might sell himself into servitude. It was only to work off his debt until the year of Jubilee. So you had when the Bible says, "Owe no man nothing," it was serious. Now, somebody's going to walk up to me afterwards, "Well, I have a mortgage. I can't pay the whole thing off." Well, are you paying it every month? It's not like, well, I haven't paid it for 8 years. Okay, guess what? You're in trouble. The idea of having a creditor, and what they're saying here is you were unable to make the payments. You were unable to pay. So when the Discover card bill came in the mail, it did shock you. So. No, actually, when you were in debt, how it worked is if you had old enough children, the children got sold into slavery first, believe it or not, to pay the debt. Because they assumed at that time you still were doing something, but if you could not, you fell under the first one, under the first one that you were in poverty and all of your family went in. But if you had creditor and you had ability to have income, you sold your children into, I don't want to say sell it, because it sounds, you put your children into that situation to work off your debt while you were still working your fields, even though you weren't in poverty. But if you became in poverty, you went under, go see number 1. Yes, exactly. But if you lived beyond your means, you lost your children. if you couldn't make your payments. Don't anybody get any ideas? Yeah, and exactly. This is, our society's messed up at this particular time. Every Israelite, male or female, who had become a slave might be redeemed at any time by relatives or friends by payment that was owed. And we'll get in more into that when we get into the kinsman redeemer aspect of it. But let me explain to you the 4 ways they can be freed other than that. How to free a slave or a servant. First of all, by redemption through payment money of goods. In other words, you could pay it. Oh, look, my Uncle Ben died and left me money I could pay off. There was a redemption price. There was a price put on you, and it had to be paid in full. You could pay it, or someone else paid it, or your master may say, I'll pay it. There are instances like that. But either way, the payment had to be made. By manumission, let me spell this to you, so those of you taking notes. M-A-N-U, then write the word mission. M-I-S-S-I-O-N. Manumission. It's a bill or ticket of freedom issued by the master. The master would write you a certificate and say, manumission, your manual labor is remitted. You guys need this. Thirdly, by testamentary disposition. That means the master could specify that the slave was to be freed upon the master's death, or the master himself might go to war during the times of war. Men went off to war. The slaves didn't always go, but he'd have to be a written document that was specified, like we call a will and testament. But that, upon my death, this will happen. But the guy didn't necessarily always have to die. So it was a bill, a document that freed him at that moment. Or by an act that implied that the slave was a free citizen, such as making an heir of one slave. In other words, when the instance that I can recall that best fit is Abraham wanted a son. And he said, what about my servant? By making him an heir, he would have freed him from being a servant at that point. He became a son by adoption. So that would eliminate the servanthood aspect. He would be. So if you included or made someone part of your family or the inheritance of your family, free you to that. And the Bible does talk extensively. When I was looking some of this stuff up, it's incredible how many times slavery and servanthood has regards with, I'm just going to give you some things, sacrifices, practices of other religious functions, Passover meal, other feasts, circumcision, all have something that they give you some legal aspect of slavery that's involved. So if we were really to do a study in slavery, we could be here for quite a... he fell under, though, I will say some interesting things. He fell under the law of the Sabbath. He got his rest too, or she. I'm using the male in the generic sense. He was to receive the liberty if the case some grievous injury. In other words, if he was had an on-the-job accident, and instead of that axe-head flying up and killing somebody, he happened to cut part of his shin off, he would get time off to heal. Okay, with any extended period, unless they found that he was one of those guys that purposely, off with a foot, kind of. Because we got guys. Anyway, got to know some of the guys in the army. I know. How'd you get shot? Don't know. The enemy. How come you're missing a bullet? I don't know. Must have been the enemy. So today they get the extra points on government tests because they shot themselves. Never mind. Ruth chapter 2. It's true. Put that together, you'll know what I just said. Ruth chapter verse 4. With that in mind, now you know how Boaz is interacting with servant, the relationship he has, and you can see how kind he. I don't know where he was while the field being worked on. Obviously, he may have been in the office or somewhere or off on another field. Sure, he wasn't flying a helicopter around. But it says that verse 4 says, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you, and may the Lord bless you. Now, I for the life of me, I couldn't understand where it says he came from Bethlehem, but they were in Bethlehem. So what he must mean, and it's the only thing I can help you all with this, is they were outside the city limits. He was in the city proper itself, and being here within the city probably was proper, even though they were in the field. Most cities don't have their agri part of their city wasn't central to the city. The agricultural part was outside the city. Yes. Huh? Yeah, I understand that. But I'm saying, you weren't there in Ruth, though. No, I understand that. What I'm saying is, when they say she's in Bethlehem, but he's going to Bethlehem, and he came from Bethlehem, but he's in Bethlehem, I think the kids were not central to the city part. But what I want to say is may the Lord with you, and may the Lord bless you. So he's saying them that within this, whatever they're doing, that the Lord be in their work. And they're saying, well, God should bless you. How do you like that? Go to work one morning and say, God, I hate being here. You know, think all the things you think about when you walk into work instead of saying, hey, the Lord be with you, and they respond, hey, may the Lord bless you. Wouldn't that be really kind of like, not my job. But here's the boss initiating it. Here's the boss initiating. How would you feel as a worker or an employer under that kind of a circumstance? Yeah, that's a question. I'm prayerfully we'll get used to this. Prayerfully we'll get used to this, and we will have them all answered by the end of the session. That's what I'm trying to hope prayerfully do. Then Boaz said, verse 5, then Boaz said to his servants, in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Now, something stood out about her. I'm going to say this. Beyond a shadow of doubt, this is what I feel. He knew who his workers were. He knew who his servants were, knew who worked in his fields, and he said, that's a face I ain't seen before. Where'd she come from? And he's probably asking that aspect. Not being nasty, being very inquisitive as a good boss, saying, okay, I see people out here working, they're doing a job, and walking over the field, and I don't know who that is. Who is it? And he's asking the right person, he's asking the foreman. It says servant in charge. I don't know what the NIV says, but I like foreman. Works for me. Huh? It does say foreman in the NIV? Oh, see, they do good choice. Okay, that's a question. And the servant in charge said she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. Now, again, let's get a good grasp of what. Now, let me give you a picture of the fields, so you can get a position of where she's at. When the field harvested, they started in rows and worked them to the edges. The corners weren't cut. So you got to figure. And behind, you got the guy with the scythe cutting, and you got the reapers, the people picking up the stalks and bundling them, and somebody going behind them and picking those up and carrying them off the field. Anything left behind was poor people. Those are the people now, gathering with the little pieces you can think. I can't get you to understand other than that they were the guys behind them getting what's left of the tomato fields in this area. You look at the tomatoes and say, when I was younger, I didn't understand why every tomato they picked was green. And then I get to know some of the Damaris years ago, and I was just stupid. They can't ship red tomatoes by the time they got to the market. Okay? But in the field, when you see the tomatoes red, don't get them. Because why? I mean, most people make it clone and stuff can't them. So you got to pick that one. The stuff that was thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Now she was first thing you can think of. Wow, she's and now she's sitting in there smoking and sitting in the house. No, think of this as posted piece of something over the top called a lean-to. It's just a place to get shade. There was a place out of the way to get out of the weather for a little bit. I saw a couple of guys doing the yard work today out on my route, and they had found one of those big fan palms, and they were all huddled under the fan palm drinking some water. It was bad today. So I was thinking, hey, that's what Ruth was doing. She's in the lean-to, just getting the water, catching up with, getting out of the sun for a little bit, getting that Kool-Aid or whatever they were offering in the tent. And not only that, this, according to the requirements, this probably wasn't where everybody else was sitting. In other words, all the workers, when they were taking their break, she was sitting in some old dumpy place. So just think of an old lean-to versus, I know this is, like, what's the difference between an old one and a new one? I have no idea, but all it said is the slaves never sat in the servants and the poor people sat separately in different lean-tos. So, the only thing I can think of, is never mind, I don't even want to go there. But at this particular moment, think of the picture that's been generated. God is in control of everything. Here's Ruth, a no-account Moabitess, happened to be in the field of Boaz, happened to be a relative, and he happens to be a very godly man. And Ruth is in search of what? A husband or food? Food. She's not on a manhunt. Nowhere in here does it say, manhunt. But I want to make an observation. What is her work ethic like? Okay, she's honest. You're allowed input now. Hardworking. Why? Sun up to sundown. Do you realize how long a day that is? Well, but both, because what you're saying is true. She respected the law, which she really wasn't familiar. She's a Moabite. What does she know about the law? She's been listening. She's being taught. She's being very respectful. Notice how she first asked Naomi if it's okay I can go. Now she's asked this guy, the servant in the field, can I glean? Okay? And then it says, and she remained from the morning until now. She'd been working the whole day. She never stopped. I just find that amazing. How many people work for like 30 minutes and say, I got to take a break. Why? You're barely sweating. You used to say, well, why are you stopping? Verse 8. Actually, before we read verse 8, let's go to Deuteronomy 24. I want to read this. Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. I think we read this before, but refresh your memory since it's been a week. Yeah, I just want to reread this, just to remind you that these are biblical requirements and how everybody in this picture. Remember chapter 1. Chapter 1, nobody understood the biblical requirements. They looked and they saw famine. They couldn't see God's hand on it. That was part of discipline. What did they do? They left the will of God. Now in chapter 2, all of a sudden, everybody understands biblical, what the Bible has to say. Because it says in verse 19, it says, when you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to pick it up. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive tree, I don't know why you want to beat your olive tree. You shall not go over through the valve again. It shall be for an alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And you shall remember that you are a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. Now, what's happening is they're reminding him, we're all been slaves at one point. Now, remember somebody else that might need something. And this is how you remember them. And they're all remembering, all of a sudden, hey, the Bible's playing the forefront. God's Word is important. We're in chapter 1. What was important? Pardon me? So anyway, back to Ruth chapter 2, verse 8. Actually, we're still in verse 7. A few more points on verse 7. Maybe I'm being nitpicky. Are they married yet? Okay, make some observations on them not being married yet, how they're interacting, and pardon me? Boaz and Ruth are not married. But notice how, listen, it's kind of interesting. What do you think of her attitude? I like that. Proverbs 31, keep that. We'll go in there later. She's got a Proverbs 31 kind of attitude. She's that kind of woman. She's that kind of woman. Well, you could read it if you don't know what it is. Or we're going to be studying it in a few weeks. What do you think about Boaz? Enough was said about this word, right? Okay, so far, what did you say? Match? You know, if you're doing, as a kid, I remember the girls that I used to hang out with, one of them, they used to make this thing, oh, this is the things I like about this guy, and these are the things, I don't like, and before you knew it, the don't like list was real long and the guy was dumped. But if you look at the list of things, don't the list of Naomi's qualities and Ruth's qualities and Boaz's, don't they kind of match? And isn't it kind of interesting that most people, when they go into a marriage, they say, well, they'll change afterward. These two people have qualities that you look for ahead of time. It says, so if anything, you write this down, they had a display of right attitudes before marriage, not changing attitudes after marriage. And somebody once told me when I said that to them about something, they said, yeah, but you get married, your attitudes change. I said, relax. Not that bad. You know what most people don't understand about marriage? Seriously. Two become one. How come two always end up being divided? Think about that. If the two are to become one, that means there's a unity coming around, unity of thought, unity of whatever's in their lives, that there should be a oneness. And all they say is, no, that's a fight, we're going our separate ways. Going our separate ways. And that's not oneness. Second point I want to make within this, how much money does Boaz have? Well, according to my Bible, he's called a man of great wealth. So he's doing all right. He's doing all right. How much does Ruth have? So, when she's done, that she's got to schlep home. Money does not buy good manners or class. Therefore, class and good manners are not dependent on one's financial status. You either are or you ain't. Think you are or you ain't. Some people say, well, if I had this, I'd be more classy. And if I was brought up like this, and I'm a product of, what do we call it today? A dysfunctional family. Okay, show me how many functional families you find in the Bible. This is a test. When you're done, find me how many functional families you find in the Bible. Oh. Dysfunctional families, people. Know what functional families are? Not real. We all have something that's not perfect with somebody in our family. And what life is all about is finding ways to work out our differences and not be a victim of our circumstances. And too many people use that as a crutch. Well, if I had this or if I had that, I wouldn't be like, no. However, they are dependent on genuine humility, which is dependent on, now we see at this moment that Bible doctrine is within them. They are now using what they've learned about the Word of God and reflecting it on their actions. And all I can say at the end of this verse, what a great work ethic. One of the things that I've been, what is those words called? My pet peeves. Is I say, why can't people do things like I do? I want to work all day. When I start a project, I want to do it all day and get it done. And I look at my kids and say, can you take out the garbage? Can you move this? And they say, work like that. Dad setting a good example. And, that's not something that's forced upon people. Look, did anybody force Ruth to do what she did? Did anybody force Boaz to behave like he did? So there is a work ethic that's innate in all of us that we have to also, what? Enhance once in a while. Verse 8 that we choose. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids." And the first thing I can say is, whoa, this guy is, I'll tell you, if there's anybody that's more genuine a person, and I grew up, when you turned to be 13, you were told to be a mensch. You were a mensch. You remember that, Mark, that term? You were a mensch, a man. And when you were taught to do manly things, there's certain things you were, as a man, you're supposed to do. You know? And one of those things is you're supposed to be courteous to women. I saw Hagar to Herman. But I mean, there's certain standards that were set up for you. Now that you're a man, you're supposed to do certain things. You know, you never could say, "Well, I can't do that." No, you're a man. You're supposed to, do that. And one of the things is courtesy towards people. And listen, when Boaz says, "Listen carefully," do not go glean in another field. And you say, "Well, why is he like enslaving her?" But he's not. He's protecting her. He's protecting first, not providing. The law has provided for her. She is provided for as far as food is right now. He's protecting. Well, she's a what? And a widow and a Moabite. She's got 3 strikes against her. She goes in another field that someone doesn't like, someone who's widowed, doesn't want to help her out. She's divorced. Moabite. She's a woman, and she's a Moabite. Those are 3 accounts against her. Yeah, and everybody was doing right in their own eyes. And Boaz knew what was decided about. Furthermore, do not go from this one, but stay here with my maids. And what he basically says, not maids like somebody that does the cleaning in the house, but those were the women servants. He basically, no. He didn't. He put her down as family. She became, remember, he's a kin of Naomi's. Once this guy said something, I'm sure he knew who it was. He was a man of renown. He was a leader within the community. And when they said, "This is Ruth the Moabite," he's already gotten the word. He came from where? Bethlehem. What happened? Verse 19. For chapter 1, verse 19. So they both went. They came to Bethlehem, and it came about when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred up about them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" So who was stirred up about him? All the people in what? Where was Boaz in? Case closed. So he probably knew Naomi was back with some woman. He hadn't met her. Yeah, okay. Sorry. I wanted to go back to the city, though. Yeah, let's, well, hey, that's a good place to quit. We've done a verse. Let me mark it. All right, Kevin, let's do this. I don't want to do questions on the tape. Just knock the tape off, and then we'll just leave